Sorry about that. Welcome back, students. We're going to be moving on with our review, and now we're going to be talking about evolution. All right, so evolution, by far, one of the most recent things we've actually covered. Multiple parts to this, but the first thing we're going to start with is the evidence for evolution, right? 5 main components to this particular section of this unit. When we're trying to determine whether or not evolution was a viable theory, we had to provide evidence for it, right? As any scientist would. Anytime you're trying to present a new idea, new theory, or new way of thinking, you have to provide evidence, right? So when we look at the evidence for evolution, it falls into 5 categories. The first of which is fossil record. As you know, the deeper we dig, the older the fossils we find, the older the organisms. And when you look at the distribution of the fossils within an area for a particular species, what you're going to notice is that the population will have distinct differences. Things that set it apart from the previous generations, plural generations, because we're talking about a lot of time here. So as we uncover a specific type of organism through fossil record, and we start to dig deeper to see what they looked like prior to that fossil, and we go back multiple generations, we're able to see changes that occurred within that particular population, within that species, if you will, that show us that they have changed over time. They were responding to their environment in a way that favorable traits were allowed to show up more often, and what could have been a unique trait for a few became the norm for the population as a whole. And we'll talk about why that works when we get to natural selection. Then we have biogeography. This is where we're looking at the distribution of species, the distribution of organisms on the planet as well. When we look at, this is something that Alfred Wegener also used to kind of promote his theory of continental drift, is that the distribution of these organisms had a lot to do with why they start to show up in different ways or start to show different features, right? So if we have organisms that are separated by geography, for example, Darwin's finches, we've talked exclusively about them for the most part with the Galapagos Islands, the geography that separated them for speciation to occur, for this new species to form through this process of evolution was geography. By separating them with oceans or with mountains or with large canyons, and then those organisms having to adapt to the environments in which they're now located in, right? So this separation of specific species that are having to kind of acclimate themselves to their new environment and find ways to overcome the challenges that they have in terms of finding food and habitat and a mate, allow us to see evidence that they changed based on their geography, not just themselves and their own DNA, all right? And then we move into things like homologous structures, which I've included a diagram over here. We're going to dig into that one a little bit deeper. But homologous structures, as well as homologous genes and homologous embryo development. Notice the homologous term there showing up 3 times. Homologous means same or similar, right? So we're talking about similar structures. And we're going to detour away from this into our diagram over here. Similar structures are referring to the idea that when you look at certain parts of organisms, for example, here I have human, cat, whale, and bat. These are limbs for all 4 of those organisms. You're going to see a similar distribution or arrangement of the bone structure for these limbs. And so you'll notice here with the human arm, we have a humerus, the radius, the ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. These are the bones that make up the arm and hand for a human, simplified obviously for our purposes, and color-coded so that we can kind of see the distribution a little bit better. And when you compare that to a cat, you'll see a very similar distribution. Are the bones exactly the same shape and size? No. But what we're looking at here is very similar distribution. The level of organization for that limb is homologous. It's similar to the structure, right? So when you take that and then you compare that to a whale, and then lastly a bat, you can see where despite the differences in what we would expect to see on these organisms, right? There's a big difference between the flipper of a whale or the fin of a whale and the arm of a human versus the wing of a bat. We know that outward appearance, it does look distinctly different, but the organization of the skeletal structure within is very similar. The bone shape is different once again, but the level of organization is similar enough that we have to assume at this point that this is good evidence to determine that there was a common ancestor in which the level of specialization we have for these organisms came from, derived from, right? For homologous genes, this is very similar to what we're talking about with homologous structures. Homologous genes just means that we have specific sequences of DNA that are the same from one organism to the next. The more genes you have similar with an organism, the more likely you have a more recent common ancestor. When you start looking at, let's say, just primates, which category we fall into as well, and you compare our DNA in the chromosomes with a chimp, then you're going to notice a 98.5 similarity in terms of our sequences. So there's a lot of genes that we have in common with chimps. These are those homologous genes that will obviously provide evidence that there is a common ancestor for us and chimps, which is why we all fall into that category of primate, right? Human, chimp, gorillas, monkeys, all of these primates have homologous genes. The ones with more in common obviously have a more recent common ancestor. And this is where you get into the differences between descended from or related to. So we're not saying descended from, we're just saying related to because of these homologous structures and these homologous genes. Lastly, we have homologous embryo development. When you're looking at organisms in utero, right, before they've been born, whether they're in the womb or in the egg, what we've noticed with regards to most all species, there's a lot of similarities between the embryos. The early stages of development for the organism, when you compare birds and fish and reptiles and humans, the embryo, the very beginning stages of that organism's development looks very similar. A lot of the structures are very similar to the degree that it's almost hard to tell the difference between them. And because of this embryonic development stage being so similar amongst all organisms, most organisms, it definitely shows a connection. Now, obviously, as the embryo continues to develop, it starts to set itself apart. Obviously, we find distinct differences between organisms as well. But those early stages show at least some connection to those organisms that provide us evidence to support the theory of evolution, that there is a common ancestor that we are all connected to. That moves us into the idea of like, how does this actually work, right? How does the process of evolution actually work? And that's where Charles Darwin presented his theory of natural selection. So natural selection basically states, here's my definition here for you, is that organisms that are better adapted, pay attention to that word there, better adapted for their environment are able to survive, reproduce, and pass on favorable traits. Right? So survival obviously is key. That's goal number one for any organism. Survive, live, right? Make sure you have access to food, water, shelter. However, reproduction is also a goal of most organisms. And this is an opportunity to continue the species, right? To perpetuate the species. How do we do that? We find a mate and we pass on traits. We've already talked about reproduction and the way that obviously, we create our gametes and the combination of DNA that allows us to create organisms. And so when we're looking at reproduction and these favorable traits, keep this in mind. If you are better adapted, better suited for the environment you're in to survive and find a mate, you are going to pass on all of those traits that helped you survive and find a mate. Which means the next generation is also well suited for the environment. Any traits that are not favorable, this is the key to natural selection. If you have traits that are not favorable, traits that do not help you survive, then you will most likely not live long enough to reproduce, and those bad traits do not get passed on to the next generation. Now, can they still show up as recessive traits? Of course. However, what you will begin to notice is that the traits that are best suited for that species in that moment, within that environment, that could have been unique for a few will start to become the norm for the population. And that's the key here. And I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions with regards to natural selection and evolution is that the population changes over time. This is evolution, in fact. It's that the population will change over time, not the individual. You're either born with favorable traits or you're not. Your traits will not change once you're already an organism doing your thing, right? Living your life, trying to survive, trying to find a mate, trying to reproduce, right? You either have those traits or you don't. And if you don't have those traits, well, then odds are you're not going to survive and you're not going to reproduce and pass them on. If you do, then you do get to provide the next generation with that same opportunity to have those favorable traits that allow them to survive and reproduce. And the more these traits start to show up as favorable, the more you'll see those traits getting passed on to the next generation. Over time, what could have been unique, once again, as I already mentioned, becomes the norm. And so the entire group, after multiple generations, could look and act distinctly different from previous generations. Because previous generations, maybe there were only a few unique individuals that had favorable traits. And so as they continue to reproduce, their offspring and their offspring and their offspring continue to pass on those traits to the extent that we are starting to see less unfavorable traits, more favorable traits, and the population changes. This is a very long process. So we're starting to look at the idea of evolution and common ancestry, and we're going to get into classification here in a bit, trying to find, well, how do we go from human to cat? Well, we're not saying we're descended from one or the other. We're just saying we're related to each other because of these homologous structures, this idea of evolution. But we're talking about a lot of time to connect common ancestors. Lots of time, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, where you're going to find that common ancestor from which we went off in one direction and they went off in another direction. And this is that idea of speciation, how new species are formed, right? This is the related to, not descended from idea that I think trips up a lot of people. All right. From this, obviously, we can take it a little bit further and make it a little bit more complex and start looking at specific populations, looking at external factors or environmental changes that could kind of disrupt those favorable traits. And keep that in mind. If you have an adaptation, that is a favorable trait, but it is entirely circumstantial. Okay? You don't necessarily show up with favorable traits. The traits that are favorable are based on the environment in which you're located. So if it's a good thing for an organism to have dark coloration, it's going to be born with dark coloration or it's not. If it's born with dark coloration and the environment determined that that's a good thing, then that dark coloration is now an adaptation. It's a favorable trait that's going to get passed on. If you are not born with that trait, you're not going to develop it. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, then you don't have the favorable trait. There's a good chance you're not going to survive. And if you don't survive, well, then you can't reproduce, right? So adaptations are these traits that the environment determines. Nature has determined whether or not that's a good thing to have or not. And if it's a good thing to have, then we'll start to see more of it because you'll get to pass that on to future generations. Throughout this process of natural selection, the survival of the fittest, if you will, we start to move into the idea of the entire population changing over time, which is what obviously we're going to define evolution as, right? The population changing over time. Hopefully that clears up a few ideas for you. Any confusion, I would say definitely reference your notes. There was a lot of content that we covered in this unit. I tried to simplify it for you here, but thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.